spending. About half of that is paid for with about
In this weekend's episode, 3 segments from this past week's Washington Journal. First, Marc Goldwein of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget discusses his organization's recent analysis of the Republican Tax Cuts and Spending Cuts bill. Then, a discussion with McCain Institute's Evelyn Farkas about the latest in efforts to forge a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine and the future of U.S. involvement. Finally, former FEMA Chief of Staff Michael Coen discusses FEMA's readiness as the 2025 hurricane season kicks off. But we begin with the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget's Marc Goldwein on the cost of the president's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill and impact on the national debt.
Mr. Goldwein, on the One Big Beautiful Bill, we've had some disagreement about the fiscal impact of that legislation. The Congressional Budget Office says it'll add $2.4 trillion to federal deficits. The White House Budget Director says it'll save $1.4 trillion. What say you?
There's not really disagreement among those that are seriously looking at this budget. By our estimates, it will add $3 trillion to the debt, including interest. And if it's made permanent, it will add $5 trillion. The way that White House is saying it'll save money is they want to ignore about $4 trillion worth of tax cuts. They want to sort of give themselves credit for tax cuts that are currently about to expire, extending them for free. But they don't want to charge themselves the cost of all of the new temporary policies in this bill.
So explain that for folks who are trying to wrap their heads around it.
Yeah. So I guess here's one way to think about it. This bill has about $6 trillion of tax cuts and new spending. About half of that is paid for with about $3 trillion worth of offsets. So that's $3 trillion total of cost. But what the administration is saying is we were going to extend these tax cuts anyway for a cost of $4 trillion. And so if you subtract that $4 trillion we were already going to do, it's about $1 trillion of savings. The problem with that is you don't get credit for we were gonnas. You don't get credit for this might have happened otherwise. The other problem is embedded within this bill is actually a ton of temporary tax cuts themselves that they're probably gonna extend later. And so if you do the gonnas on both sides, it's still $1 trillion added to the debt.
The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has taken a look at this. CRFB is where you can go for their website. And one of the things in your analysis that you write is that this bill front loads its costs and back loads its savings. Explain what that means.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. In 2027, that's the first year the bill's fully in effect because it takes time to get a new tax code, et cetera. This bill's going to add $500 billion to the deficit. By 2030, it's only going to add $200 billion. That number goes down. But it's not going down because the bill is actually getting cheaper over time. It's going down, as I mentioned before, because a lot of the most expensive parts of the bill expire. It is a 4-year defense increase. Then all of a sudden, we're going to go back to the old inadequate Defense Department. It has 4 years
Something
of no
that's
tax.
probably not likely going to happen by members of Congress.
Exactly. Inadequate by their own description, right? It has 4 years of no taxes on tip, no taxes on overtime, tax cuts for seniors, tax breaks for businesses, and then they all disappear. That's not their intention. They don't want these to disappear. What they're doing is they're using only 4 years so they can make it seem cheaper in a 10-year scoring window, right? If it's only 4 years, it looks like it's 40% as expensive, but actually it's just 40% as long.
So let's back up perhaps. Explain the difference between debt and deficit and why, when we're talking about the cost of this thing, why are we talking about a 10-year scoring? Why are we talking 10 years down the road?
Yeah, so 10 years, the typical convention that we use for scorekeeping. It's not perfect. There's no magic over 10 years versus 9 years or 11. But I think the thinking is it's long enough that you capture all the policies having gone into effect. Because policies sometimes take a while to implement. But it's not so long that it's ridiculous. Like, who knows what's going to happen 50 years from now? We'll all have flying cars or something. And when we look at this, we look at two aspects. One is we look at the deficit effect. That is basically what's the difference between spending and revenue every single year? And how much is this going to worsen it? So already we are running $2 trillion deficits each year. Under this bill, it's going to go up to $2.5 trillion deficits each year. Then it looks at the debt effect. That's the accumulation of all the past deficits. That's how much we owe. It's not how much more we spend than we raise. It's how much we owe in total from all our past spending in excess of all of our past revenue. And from that perspective, this bill is going to add $3 trillion over 10 years and climbing. And by the way, $5 trillion if we make all of these temporary provisions permanent.
CRFB fb.org is where you can go to see the breakdown of the costs and the savings in this bill, how we get to some of these numbers that we've been talking about. For people for whom it's hard to wrap your head around trillions of dollars in debt and deficit and 10 years down the road, what does this mean for things like inflation and interest rates, the things that impact everyday Americans every day?
Yeah. So what we've learned, what economists have known, and I think the public has recently learned, is that debt is actually really bad for people's standard of living. When you have a huge increase in debt, like we did in 2021 and 2022 for the pandemic, what you can see is high rates of inflation. And that's what we saw. But even if the debt is gradual, and so the Federal Reserve can fight the inflation part, debt pushes up interest rates. That means your mortgage is going to cost more. It means your car loan is going to cost more, your student loan, your credit card debt. And it also means costs are actually more expensive for the federal government. So I don't think many people know this, but right now, interest is the second largest line item in the budget. The only thing bigger is Social Security. We spend more on interest than on defense, more on interest than Medicare. Think about that. We are spending more servicing our debt than defending our country or providing health care to our seniors. That's amazing.
Does the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget take policy positions on things like Medicaid work requirements or clean energy tax credits, the things that make up the numbers that add up to the trillions that we're talking about?
Yeah, so we are a nonpartisan organization, and legitimately, we're down the line. Our board is pretty evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, some independents. They have all sorts of different views on specific policies. The positions we do take are about overall fiscal responsibility, right? So we don't want a bill that's adding to the debt. We need a bill that's actually reducing the debt, because debt is already at record levels. Now, within that, we're actually very pleased to see some offsets in this bill. Remember, I mentioned there's $3 trillion worth of offsets. That would be a great start towards deficit reduction. The problem is those are being used to pay for tax cuts and then to borrow another leverage to borrow another $3 trillion, rather than being used to help reduce our massive levels of debt.
Explain what a rescission is.
Yeah, so Congress every year is supposed to appropriate money. You know, they appropriate defense money and State Department money, et cetera. There's then an opportunity to claw back the money that's not being spent. And then to borrow another $3 trillion. This administration has asked for about $10 billion of rescissions. They want Congress to claw back about $10 billion of money they've appropriated. And there's a special process they can do that with only a simple 50-vote majority, exempt from the normal filibuster that makes almost everything in the Senate require.
How does CRFB feel about rescissions in general? Are they a good thing?
Yeah, absolutely. We should cut spending we're not using, right? So again, we can debate over, is this specific rescission the right one? But if there's money that's not being used, this money's not being used efficiently, we ought to claw it back. And this is the appropriate process. The president identifies the spending that he views as wasteful, and then Congress has an opportunity to vote on it and decide whether or not they agree.
Can we fix the long-term debt issue via rescissions or things like DOGE cuts?
No. Only about a quarter of the entire budget is appropriated every year. And only about 13% of that is on the non-defense side, and only a small share of that are things that are actually subject to DOGE or rescissions, et cetera. So like, even let's say we're able to somehow cut a quarter of that non-defense discretionary. That's a ridiculously high number. Even a quarter, that's only like 2% of our budget, right? 3% of our budget. That's not going to solve the debt. To solve the debt, we got to look at the major spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and we got to look at taxes.
Next, McCain Institute Executive Director Evelyn Farkas gives us an update on peace talks between the Ukraine and Russia earlier this week, and the impact of that surprise drone attack by the Ukrainians that some have called Russia's Pearl Harbor.
So diplomats met yesterday in Turkey. What happened?
Well, they agreed on some prisoner exchanges, but there was no real progress made in terms of getting to a durable peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, so a couple of things have happened that we want to talk about. So first is this drone attack. This is the front page of the Washington Times. Ukraine assault shifts war's momentum. Quote, Russian Pearl Harbor puts pressure on Putin to take peace talks seriously. So what was this Russian Pearl Harbor?
Well, first, it wasn't really a Pearl Harbor because remember, Russia attacked Ukraine starting in 2014 and then full frontal assault in 2022 where they attacked the civilian population of Ukraine. So this wasn't, an attack out of the blue. However, it was a surprise shock attack that had strategic impact. It had strategic impact psychologically, and according to the various estimates, up to as many as a third of Russia's carrier strike capability. So the cruise missile strike capability was knocked out. So about 10, the New York Times is estimating about 10 bombers. This is significant, not just in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, Mimi. It's significant in terms of Russia being the number one adversary of the United States and our European allies, threatening not just Ukraine, but other countries in the region.
And that's a video that you just saw on your screen of that drone attack. So apparently some spies snuck the drones in and then remote controlled, did the attack all at once. And these are some pretty far away areas that they were able to strike.
Right. I mean, what it demonstrates is, first of all, a high level of sophistication in terms of intelligence capability, in terms of military operations, and then also sophisticated strategy. The Ukrainians started planning this, I'm not sure whether it was over a year ago, but certainly months ago. They smuggled these drones into Russia proper and very far into Russia proper. And so they clearly had help. I would imagine they had some help inside. But the Ukrainians are saying all the operatives were exfiltrated. I can't believe that that's true, and I'm sure the Russians don't believe that that's true. Nevertheless, they then launched a simultaneous attack remotely. The drones took off from these boxes. They opened up. The boxes were launched on trucks. The boxes opened up, again, remotely, simultaneously, and attacked these airfields, multiple airfields, 3 or 4, I believe. And I think our intelligence community is probably doing the estimates as well in terms of the damage. But it's undeniable that there's been severe damage, and I'm sure the Kremlin is assessing their options now.
There's also this on CNN. Ukraine says it has struck bridge connecting Russia to Crimea with underwater explosives. And you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see that explosion right here on your screen. If you can see that, that's on CNN. Has the momentum shifted in this war because of these two attacks? I mean, has everything changed?
I wouldn't call it a game changer, but I think in retrospect, this will be a turning point. The attack on the bridge connecting Crimea with the Russian mainland, the so-called Kerch Bridge, this was the third time the bridge was attacked. Maybe this one will be the one that really damages the bridge so much so that the Kremlin gives up on having that bridge there. I doubt it. I think for Putin, this is really a point of pride. When he put that bridge up, he was there to christen it. Having said that, this is important also psychologically. Coming after the militarily and psychologically significant drone attack, this is a psychological attack much more than a military one, although they do use that bridge, for resupply and for civilian transport. The reality is that I think the Kremlin's going to have to stop and assess, because they've been damaged significantly in their ability to hit Ukraine. And Ukraine is showing that they have, cards up their sleeves, so to speak, that they have more surprise. Maybe there are more surprises coming, we don't know, but they're being very proactive and they're taking the initiative. So if I were the Russians, I would hurry to the negotiating table. The other thing, Mimi, is, and maybe you're going to get to this, other things that the United States can threaten: sanctions, increased military aid to Ukraine.
I do definitely want to get to sanctions, but what do you make of reports that the United States was not notified of this drone attack before it happened?
I think that's normal. The Ukrainians haven't been notifying America, as far as we know, when they've taken proactive, military operations like this in the past. So, for example, when they launched an effort into the Russian territory and seized the Russian territory of Kerch, which they recently lost, but that was over a year ago. When they did that, they also didn't check with us, to our knowledge, or at least what was reported in the media. The Ukrainians, in order for this to be successful, they have to maintain operational security. And I think there's a lot of, understanding on the Ukrainian side now that they're kind of on their own. And so they are taking whatever independent action they can very quietly.
Sanctions.
Yeah.
Russia is currently under sanctions.
That's correct.
Have they worked so far?
Well, they've put strain on the Russian economy. So the Russian interest rate is at 21% or so. Inflation's at 10%. They are clearly stressed. They're using their foreign reserves. they're reliant heavily. I think about 70% of their energy sales are going to China and India combined. If these new sanctions that Senator Graham very helpfully drafted up and got Senator Blumenthal to co-sponsor, got 82 senators to sign on, if these new sanctions go into effect, they would have a significant impact on Russia's economic situation because they would include sanctions on any countries buying that fuel from Russia, so oil and gas.
So who's buying fuel from Russia?
China and India primarily. They, like I said,
but also Europe, right?
Also Europe. And so the Europeans have said we're ready to also join the United States in these secondary sanctions, and we're ready to also, frankly, inflict or take more pain in their economy.
What do we know about Russia's conditions for ending this war?
They're maximalist. They haven't changed since the beginning. Vladimir Putin wants to control Ukraine, doesn't want Ukraine to be a sovereign state, and certainly not a democratic state on his border. He has a neo-imperial vision. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire, starting with Ukraine. Frankly, Moldova and Georgia, all the former Soviet states are targets in his writings and in his statements. And Europe isn't safe either in terms of his desire to weaken our allies and the United States itself.
But is he coming to the table with, give me the entire country and then I'm going to take other parts of Europe? I mean, he's not saying that publicly.
He's talking about root causes, and to him, root causes are that Ukraine wants to be independent, that Ukraine doesn't recognize that Ukraine should be part of the Russian Federation. So, and also that Ukraine should have its ability to defend itself against Russian attacks. So Russia does not want Ukraine to join any kind of military alliance, NATO. Russia does not want Ukraine to have a guarantee from the United States that's bilateral. That would prevent Russia, again, from using its military against Ukraine. So these are, territory. I mean, the Russian government has given no indication of wanting to compromise and give up any territory to Ukraine. In fact, they've asked for more than they control on the ground militarily. So we have not seen any movement in terms of Putin's criteria for coming to an agreement. The Ukrainians, I think they're open to compromise. This is not something they're talking about publicly, but I would imagine that they are discussing this with the Trump administration. And so they are willing to compromise on certain things.
Finally, with hurricane season already underway, a conversation with Michael Coen, former FEMA Chief of Staff in both the Obama and Biden administrations.
So, explain to us your previous roles with FEMA and your experience with disaster management.
Sure. Recently, I was Chief of Staff to Administrator Deanne Criswell at FEMA during the Biden administration. I was also Chief of Staff for Craig Fugate during the Obama administration at FEMA. I started my career in emergency management working for James Lee Witt during the Clinton administration at FEMA.
Well, as you know, hurricane season has kicked off. It started this past Sunday, and it goes through November. Do you think FEMA is ready for that?
I think FEMA has robust capability. I don't think they're as ready as they have been in the past. I believe with staff departures, morale, cuts to training and travel has reduced FEMA's coordination with states and local governments.
There was an internal document that was released recently where FEMA said that they're not ready. What do you make of that?
I think that that's them being realistic of what their challenges are for this season, and them preparing their leadership for the challenges ahead, and directing and presenting to their leadership that they need direction on what is expected of them based on the reduced capability at the agency, and letting the new acting administrator know up front, this is not going to be easy.
I want to talk about the acting administrator, but first, if you can kind of delineate those changes that have taken place as far as budget cuts and how many people from FEMA have been laid off.
Yeah, so there was only 200 people that actually been fired. Most of the departures have been people that have left because of morale, because of the unknown of what's going to happen with the agency. From the first week of this administration, President Trump and senior leadership in the administration have talked about the role of FEMA and whether it should be eliminated. For career employees, that's troubling. Your agency is being talked about and not being valued. Do you stay and continue to put your all when you're eligible to retire, when you're not being respected? So a lot of employees, I estimate maybe about 2,000 employees have departed since January 20th.
Do you think that there's bloat in FEMA, that level can be absorbed and that they can be more efficient with less people?
Well, a lot of the leaders that have left left with a lot of institutional knowledge. There's a lot of experience in emergency management. We learn every year from responding to events, and with this continuous improvement, we become stronger and better in responding to new challenges. With the departure, there's going to be a lack of capacity. Also, as far as cuts, some of the programs that were cut were in particular in mitigation, the building resilient infrastructure communities, which was really focused on reducing future disaster costs by helping states and communities build resilient infrastructure.
When you say a lack of capacity to do what?
Lack of capacity to support multiple events simultaneously, support the coordination, multiple disasters.
A forest fire on this side of the country, a hurricane on that side.
Hurricane, or it could be earthquake, could be 2 hurricanes. FEMA doesn't always have the opportunity to just respond to one disaster at a time. Sometimes multiple things happen at the same time. And if there's two catastrophic events happening simultaneously, it's going to be a challenge.
When you and you also mentioned mitigation strategies. Can't that and shouldn't that be done by the states themselves? Why would the federal government need to get involved in that?
The states do. All states have mitigation plans in place. The states do put robust resources into mitigation, but the federal government is an important resource as far as funding to fund projects across the country.
What are your thoughts on the current FEMA management and specifically the acting administrator, David Richardson?
I think it's unfortunate that we have the second acting administrator since January 20th who has no experience in emergency management. So the career staff will be spending a lot of time just educating him on the basics of emergency management, the functions of FEMA, the processes in place. It's a challenging job being the FEMA administrator when you do have a career in emergency management. So it's a challenging time.
This is an article on The Hill who says FEMA chief was joking with hurricane season awareness remarks, according to DHS. And I want to show you Caroline Levitt, who was responding to that, and we'll get your comments.
Well, of course, we know that we are into hurricane season now, and I know FEMA is taking this seriously, contrary to some of the reporting we have seen based on jokes that were made and leaks from meetings. But Secretary Kristi Noem and the FEMA leadership are all over this. They are committed to ensuring that federal resources and tax dollars are there for Americans in need, and the president continues to review requests for emergency aid and carefully considering them. However, this president has made it clear we're not going to enable states to make bad decisions with federal tax dollars and then have the federal government later have to bail these states out. We want to see states be responsible with their tax dollars to do as much as they possibly can, and then the president will deeply and thoughtfully consider any requests for federal aid that come to his desk. And I think some of the media reporting we've seen on this is frankly sloppy and irresponsible. There are serious people who are taking this issue seriously.
And what do you think of that? And also about what happened to President Trump's original FEMA director, Cameron Hamilton?
Sure. So in regards to Acting Administrator Richardson, I don't believe it was a joke. Why would you? What's the joke about hurricane season and not understanding that hurricane season had started? How's that a joke? So I don't believe it was a joke. I believe the administration, Department of Homeland Security, and the White House is trying to cover up the inexperience of the current acting head of FEMA and trying to make it out that he was making a joke. I don't know why you would make a joke about hurricane season if you're the acting FEMA administrator. In regard to Cameron Hamilton, I believe Cameron Hamilton came in with good intentions to be a loyal political appointee in the Trump administration. He, over time, gained an appreciation for the mission at FEMA, the complexities, and when he testified to Congress, I believe he was, a man of integrity and was testifying based on what he had learned during his time at FEMA. And unfortunately, because of that, he was reassigned.
That was Michael Coen, former FEMA Chief of Staff in the Obama and Biden administrations. Hear more interviews from C-SPAN's Washington Journal on our website at cspan.org, on the C-SPAN Now app, or on C-SPAN television, live every morning from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern.